Hi, Bill. Thanks for joining us today. Jeff, thank you. Meeg, so good to see you. Walt, I know this is going to be a conversation for you, as it will for you, Brad. Hey, Dan, thank you so much for being with us today. Just want to remind our audience today that this will be an open Q&A session. Just go to the Zoom control panel and submit your Q&A so that I can get your question and yourself on the open mic. David, my goodness, so glad to have you today. Hi, Kim. Thank you for joining us. Hi, Kellen. Thank you so much for joining us. Gingy, love that name. Thanks for joining us today. Hi, Julie. Thank you for being with us. Look forward to your questions. Well, welcome and good afternoon, everyone, to the Leadership in the Age of Personalization live session. Now, whether you're joining us from Zoom or YouTube, I'm Glenn Yopes, and on behalf of GLLG, thanks. It's always a pleasure to have you join us during your afternoon. And today, we're all going to learn from Josh Linkner about his latest book, best-selling book, Big Little Breakthroughs. Now, again, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a Q&A session. So if you're on Zoom, join the control panel. Submit your questions. We've got GLLG staff on standby to make sure that we put you on an open mic. And if you're joining us live from YouTube, please submit your questions via chat. Now, I'm sure you've heard before that self-knowledge is the mother of success, but how about if I told you that success is first born of something else? You see, self-knowledge is the offspring of experience, and we learn of ourselves through that which our senses take in. And experience is the offspring of opportunities that we have actually pursued. You see, opportunity is the true mother of success. In fact, opportunity is the primary catalyst for sustaining good fortune in your career, perhaps your company or your personal life. An opportunity actually builds momentum quicker than any single other success factor. I mean, just step back and think about it a moment. One right opportunity that's skillfully pursued can create a whole host of additional opportunities that would have never otherwise existed. See, opportunities are everywhere, yet few have eyes to see and seize them. Now, our guest today, Josh Linkner, well, he knows a thing or two about seeing and seizing opportunities. See, Josh is a world-renowned expert on innovation, disruption, and hyper-growth leadership. In fact, Josh is a creative troublemaker, and don't worry, we'll talk about that in detail in a little bit, who actually started his career as a jazz guitarist and then went on to become the founder and CEO of 5 tech companies, which sold for a combined value of $200 million. See, Josh is also a deeply experienced business leader, venture capitalist, and top-rated keynote speaker, best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, that is, and professional jazz guitarist. Now, you'll hear Josh knows a thing or two about opportunity management because opportunity takes management. Let's roll it, Paulo. Hey, Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, man. Great to be with you.
Well, I hope those opening comments resonated with you. I mean, why is it that you think opportunities are right in front of us, yet we have such a hard time to see them?
Well, that's a pretty deep philosophical question. I think part of the problem is that fear creeps in. Like we're scared to try something new, and sometimes we see challenges, and we're so quick to analyze the downside. I've long said that most of us live our lives fairly conservatively, and then we have a plan B, which is even more conservative. Like, what happens if everything goes wrong of your already conservative plan? And I think we kind of owe it to ourselves to also consider having a plan Z, which is the plan instead of if everything goes wrong, what happens if everything goes right? And when you have that mindset, I think the opportunities that you describe start to become more visible.
Well, I'll tell you why people can't see them, Josh, is because we're taught in the corporate world not to see opportunity. We're taught to do what we're told to do inside the box we're given. So if we're talking about entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship, how can we be good intrapreneurs if we don't have the eyes to see the opportunities that are right in front of us? I mean, let's face it, we can't build any more momentum right now in this as we start moving away gradually from the pandemic if we don't unleash individuality and give people the freedom to do things that we should have done a long time ago. What do you think?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's such a shame to me when people hire talented, creative, smart people for their judgment and then never let them use it. And I think that really needs to change in the age of personalization, as you like to talk about. It's funny. I grew up playing jazz music. I put myself through college playing music. I still play today. And I really think that the metaphor of success, of leadership has changed. In the past, it was that of a classical musician, classical conductor, where the one person standing in the center of the room, no longer playing an instrument, and he or she is all about, getting everyone to play the notes as they're written on the page. So the job is around precision and accuracy and alignment and like heads down, do what you're told. But the problem is the world has changed. And today we live in a world of dizzying speed and exponential complexity and ruthless competition. There aren't the notes in front of us. And I believe now we all have to play jazz, which is being creative and adjusting to changing circumstances and pivoting and adapting. Yeah, it's a little bit messy and it's a little dangerous. And each of us gets to leave our own voice, and each of us has to contribute and improvise our way through because we have to perform at our best, even though the notes aren't all spelled out for us. So I think as you look at personalization, exactly what you're talking about, really the role of leadership is to empower people to bring that creativity and judgment forward rather than suppress it.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, you said it best, and I'll say it a little differently, that in personalization, it's not about being perfect. Give people the freedom of expression to figure it out. I mean, we're all so tired of these predetermined metrics for success that may have made sense 10 years ago, but not in the present. So let's get to know you a little bit more. Why is it that your personality is represented by the color bright blue?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that I've analyzed it so much, but perhaps I do. I'm drawn to it. I kind like blue skies, and I'm a blue sky kind of guy. I like trying to figure out not so much what already is there in front of you, but what's possible. Many people are so focused on what was, and I like to think about what can be. And I suppose blue skies kind of represent that. But it's kind of vibrant color. It's not like overly preachy. It's just it feels kind of good. Like, hey, let's go create something. And I think that's where it comes from.
Well, I like that. Now, what about being the creative troublemaker? I mean, how does someone become a creative troublemaker, and what's the thinking behind this? I really liked it.
Thank you. It's funny. You're probably the same way. Meet people at a cocktail party and like, what do you do? And you say I'm an author, I'm an entrepreneur, and a venture capital investor. And I just started eventually saying I'm a creative troublemaker, which always begins a good conversation. What do you mean? Like, what is that? And but the way I define it is not mean spirited. Quite the opposite. I mean, it's not hurting people. Of course not. It's the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. It's sort of the willingness to confront traditions and explore what new possibilities, to poke the bear a little bit, and I really like that. My first instinct when I see something that might be working just fine is to say, okay, let's deconstruct it. Let's figure out how to make it even better. Or if something isn't working, then rather than just trying to rebuild something that's long overdue, like I'm okay letting it go and starting something new. So to me, that's what creative troublemaking is all about. It's not hurting anybody, of course not, or bad mischief, but it's like good mischief. It's helping people and organizations and certainly myself and my businesses explore new possibilities and tinker and experiment and kind of like play jazz.
You know what? I love that. And I'll never forget it. And, Josh, when I first read it and you said it, I felt that what that meant was seeking discomfort is a good thing. And I think that and I highly recommend that everybody read your book, Big Little Breakthroughs, because I'll tell you, this will remove fear for the things that you long for. And you argue in the book that the smallest things, Josh, can actually have massive impact. So what is a big little breakthrough?
Thanks, Glenn. It's very nice of you to say. I'm really passionate about the book. I spent over 1,000 hours working on it. I did all kinds of neuroscience research and academic research. I also personally interviewed dozens of people, CEOs, billionaires, celebrity entrepreneurs, Grammy award-winning musicians, and of course, many ordinary people doing amazing things. So a big little breakthrough is the opposite of what we normally think of as innovation. Most of us think of innovation as a change the world idea. It's, inventing the light bulb. It's being Elon Musk. And the problem with that, nothing wrong with those things, but the problem is that feels out of reach for most of us mere mortals. Like when I see Mark Zuckerberg, I say, good for him, but it's kind of hard to see ourselves in that. Big Little Breakthroughs is taking the opposite, a pragmatic approach to becoming an everyday innovator, which is that instead of looking for the swing for the fence moonshots, cultivate small daily acts of creativity, little micro innovations. And when we bring this as a daily habit, like little ideas flying all around, first of all, they're way less risky. They're way more accessible to us. You're not betting your company or your career. You don't have to be in a position of authority. You're building critical skills, and those little wins add up to big, juicy success. So it's an opposite, a polar opposite view of how most people think of innovation. This is really building creativity as part of daily life and prioritizing inventive thinking and creative problem solving, not for the fun of it, although it is fun, but more importantly, to tackle challenges and seize opportunities.
Well, I saw myself in the book, and I appreciate everything that you said because, oftentimes, we feel the pressures of societal norms, think that we can only do big things if we take that big leap of faith. And you'd mentioned in the book, and by the way, before I continue, I'd like to remind our audience to submit their questions in the Q&A panel. I know that Josh is excited to speak with you. And like he told me before we started, throw him a curveball. He's ready for anything. Now, it says in the book, Josh, that a Harvard University study revealed that 77%, I couldn't believe this number, 77% of economic growth is attributed to micro innovation. So what is a micro innovation and why are they so important to our GDP?
Yeah, exactly. I was fascinated by that stat too. So most of us, again, we think of innovation and there's like a minimum threshold. Unless it's $1 billion idea, it doesn't count. And we think that innovation is only for the super billionaire elite class and it's inaccessible to us all. And while those big things, when SpaceX or Jeff Bezos or whatever grab headlines, the real like meat and potatoes is these everyday innovations, and that's what drives our economy. And you're right. So a professor named Stephen Tomke quoted saying that he did a study: 77% of the U.S. gross domestic product doesn't come from the big sexy stuff; it comes from those little innovations. So I mean, dozens and dozens of examples of them, of course, in the book. But one just pops into my mind. So we often think of innovation as only like big product related stuff, lab code, or maybe a marketing campaign. Here's a simple one. They're Expedia. I cover this in the book. They were looking at their call center. And in the Expedia call center, they recognized that the number one call that consumed a whole bunch of time was someone asking for a copy of their itinerary. And you're like, well, that's kind of silly. They auto email it. Why would they even need to? But they started digging deeper, and they learned that people sometimes put the wrong email address in. It goes to their spam folder, whatever. And what ended up happening is that this was, it was 20 million calls a year, and they estimated the cost to be $5 per call. So that's $100 million being spent on helping people get their itinerary. So what do? They started really getting a better close connection to the customer. They talked about it. They figured out two like teeniest, simplest things. Number one, they put a big, juicy, fat button on the website. Here, click here for a copy of your itinerary. Number two, on the call-in login, it says press 2 to get a copy of your itinerary. That's it. Two little changes. You know what happened? It reduced those calls by like 90%. So they saved $90 million based on the two of the simplest ideas that any one of us could have thought of. So for me, it's not about coming up with some like new device that cures cancer, although that's great. But we can all get our arms around those little things like putting a button on the website to make it easier for your customers. And those little ideas add up to big things.
So let me ask you this question. I mean, I think it's universally known that, especially amongst Fortune 500 companies, they're comfortable they're comfortable in viewing incrementalism as something good. And now, as we're coming out of this pandemic, everyone's starting to realize that, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to take some transformative leaps. Can you give us some clarity around the value of incrementalism and or why incrementalism actually gets in the way of growth?
Yeah, so I actually, okay, so many people think of incrementalism as a negative thing, like, oh, you're such a wimp, think big, and there's a time and place for different flavors of innovation. So I don't actually think of incrementalism as bad at all. I just don't think it's the only thing that we can do. So Glenn, here's how I'd frame it. Think about the word innovation written in all capital letters. Big stuff. These are the, once a decade, this is the printing press and inventing the internet and the telephone, and great, awesome. I don't have anything bad to say about those killer innovations. But if that's all that you looked at as innovation, boy, the rest of the world would kind of suffer. So now let's double click and think about the word innovation just with a capital I and the rest of it lowercase. These are innovations that it may not make history, but any one of us could come up with 2 or 3 a year that really matter. Maybe it's some idea that you drive revenue by 14%, or you reduce factory defects by 31% or something. They're meaty ideas that really drive progress. So now let's double click one more time on that word and think about all lowercase the word innovation. And sometimes people look down their nose at it and call that incrementalism in a sort of a snide way. But listen, if you have hundreds of little ideas that add up to positive gain, ain't nothing wrong with that at all. So I think I hope that everyone thinks of themselves as an artist and an innovator, regardless of their role or profession. And if you do, just like any artist, you can apply your creativity to all three of those. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be an and across all three.
Josh, this brings it up. He made me think of another follow-up here that, leaders must learn to touch the business just as much as they lead it. And as we're talking about incrementalism and or even transformative leaps, I mean, haven't you noticed in the last 10 years, it's probably longer than that corporations are trying to find growth through acquisition rather than finding it from within. Now, I get the numbers, I get why they're doing it, but as we try to unleash individuality in the age of personalization, what can corporations do differently to place more of a strategic bet on their people so that they can do the kinds of things that you're talking about? Because I know that, as we talked about at the very beginning, they're told what to do inside the box they're given, but now they know, especially those people on the front lines, know the innovative needs of an organization oftentimes better than their executives. So what do organizations need to do to place that strategic bet on their people?
You're exactly right. By the way, you can't just buy and expect to become innovative. You have to build that from within. And the way I look at it is that however many people you have in your company or organization for that matter, everyone should be an innovator. It breaks my heart when I'm at some company, they're like, oh, the creatives, they sit up on the second floor. I'm like, right. Well, I need to sit on every floor, And so I think, so what can we do is the answer to the question. If you have, 100 people in your company, you have 100 artists. If you have 100,000 people in your company, why not have 100,000 artists? And when I say that, I know people are cringing and they're thinking that I'm suggesting that people run down the halls and draw on the walls with purple crayons. Not at all. I'm suggesting that people be creative in an appropriate and thoughtful way, specifically to drive better outcomes, not just for the fun of it. Anyway, what can we do? In the book, I really carefully examined. I asked, that was the whole premise. Like, what can we do? And so as I explored innovators around the world, I said, what are the mindsets, the habits, and the tactics of the most innovative people? And if we want to effectuate change individually or organizationally, we really have to look at that. What are the mindsets, habits, and tactics? And some of those habits, the rituals and rewards that we can create as leaders really move the needle. I might give you endless examples, but one example, one of the folks that I interviewed for the book has a fun ritual. He calls it F up Fridays. Well, he says the whole word. I'll just be polite today.
Sure.
So
of
F
course.
up Fridays. Here's what it is. He brings his entire company together for like a giant brown bag lunch. And one by one, each person has to stand up and share what they effed up that week and what they learned from it. And when they finally get to somebody that didn't F something up, they're like, well, why not? What are you going to do next week? So just pausing for a second, think about the message that drives deep into that team, that responsible risk-taking is part of your job, that we have your back both in failure and success, and that you are not only responsible for X, Y, and Z, what your business card says, you are responsible for being an innovator. So that simple ritual that costs nothing sends a clear message to the team about what they want to do. So, and I can give you other examples, but the notion as leaders, we need to create rituals and rewards that support the desired outcomes that we want, which in my opinion should be inventive thinking and creative problem solving.
Well, in the age of personalization, we call that moving from results to methods. In other words, we need to allow people to experiment and make sure that they can do that knowing that there are no negative repercussions. What a simple thing. I mean, today we're all teachers and students. Josh, it just surprises me that this great example that you've given isn't something that's required in organizations. I mean, it's such a good way not to create just more ownership, but really to inspire a culture that oftentimes feels a bit disconnected. Now, I want to remind our audience to not only submit questions, but to share your views, perhaps some perspectives, maybe a story for Josh so that he can react to it. You already have a sense of what his personality is like. So he'll be connected to almost anything. In fact, we've got a question for you right now, Josh. This is coming from Brad. Brad, can you share your question and thoughts in an open mic, please?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yeah.
So this question is, while jazz music invites creative freedom, it can still be bound to chord progressions that allow a combo to play and collaborate. So within innovation, what are the chord progressions you've seen or steps that helps teams push the envelope when being innovated? You kind of reference this on habits and rituals, but I was curious your thoughts on that.
Brad, awesome question. Real quickly, do you play an instrument?
Yep, I do. Yeah. And so I love your, there's actually a book I saw called Yes, Say Yes to the Mess that invites kind of the jazz kind of theory to this type of conversation. So I love that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Brad, for asking that thoughtful question. Yeah, so it's funny. There in jazz music, you're right. There are some structural elements that keep it held together. Even though 99% of what you play on the is made up as you go, there's some markers and structure that really are helpful. There is a type of jazz that doesn't have anything called free jazz, and frankly, it's kind of hard to listen to. And so the goal of a structural approach to creativity is having enough structure so that it supports the creative process, but doesn't restrict it. And it's funny, in my first book, Disciplined Dreaming, it was the intersection of those two. How do you have enough room for dreaming and enough structure for some discipline? Those two forces have to intersect. The thing that's cool about jazz is that, Brad, if you and I were playing in a jazz group and we played the same song every night in a row for 10 years in a row, every night it would be different. Because just like this conversation is unscripted, you might say something and I would react, or I might say something and you would react. We'd build off of each other's thoughts, and you're co-creating together in front of a live audience. It's the only art form that I know of where you're both composing and performing simultaneously. And many people often ask me like, hey, how do you know you're going to get it right? That seems so risky. And here's a little secret. Jazz musicians' confidence doesn't come from knowing they're going to get it right. It comes from knowing they're going to get it wrong. I've never played a jazz. I played thousands of gigs. I've never played a gig where I didn't screw something, if not a lot of things up. And so the confidence comes from being able to react and course correct when you inevitably step on the wrong thing. By the way, there's a funny thing we always say in jazz. If you play a really bad note, like a terrible clunker, just play it twice more and call it art. Everything is cool. But back to your question, I think there are a number of things. So in the book, I cover the 8 core mindsets of everyday innovators. So these are sort of philosophical benchmarks that when we embrace, and they're very counterintuitive to what most people think, that can be, think of that as a key signature. And there are also some really specific tactics. You know, most of us, when we want to come up with ideas, we brainstorm. Brainstorming was invented in 1958. It's a terrible exercise. It's wildly out of date and impractical. So I share some much more provocative and fun techniques that we can use. Think of those as a chord or a scale that will help you bring creativity forward. So just like learning to play guitar or saxophone or piano or whatever, this is a learned skill that any one of us can embrace, develop those skills, and put them to use rather quickly.
Thank you, Brad, for your question. Now we got another question here, and I'm going to get to David in a minute, but you talk about co-creation. I mean, come on, is this really a novel thought? I mean, you know that it's all about co-creation. So why does hierarchy and rank get in the way of not just big innovations, but back to big little breakthroughs? Why is it getting in the
Too
way?
often, I know you study large organizations a lot, and what often happens is that the person in the room with the loudest voice or the fanciest title is the one whose idea gets embraced. And so part of that is a cultural issue, but part of it is a technique issue, because if everyone's like, okay, you're looking around, whose idea? Oh, boss, your idea is great. Let's do that. Like that's a terrible way to bring ideas to the surface. So there's a lot of techniques that can solve that. Back to jazz, like if the way jazz works, let's say Brad and I were on a gig and I played a little something on guitar. It wasn't very good, but he hears something in it and he picks it up on his instrument. And then the bass player grabs it and the drummer picks up something there. And then all of a sudden it gets around to the sax player who rips a killer solo to the delight of the crowd. Well, you'd say, like, who invented that idea? I mean, really, we all kind of invented that idea. Exactly. And that's the way great creativity comes to the surface. Just real quickly on technique, since we're talking about it, here's one way you can solve that boss wins every time thing. So in brainstorming, when you share an idea, we tend to share our safe ideas and hold our crazy ones back, because you don't want to offend the boss and you don't want to look foolish and you don't want to be responsible for your idea. So again, we tend to be fear-based and only share our really safe ideas. Simplest way to solve that, it's called role storming, ROLE. So in role storming, you're brainstorming in character. You're pretending that you're somebody else. So imagine if you have 5 people in the room. Now everyone gets to choose a character. One person could be a supermodel. One person could be a villain. One person could be a 5-year-old. One person could be like an alien from the future. And when you put yourself in a different persona and generate ideas as if you were that person, like as if you were Steve Jobs, here's the thing. No one's going to laugh at Steve for coming up with a big idea. They might laugh at Steve for coming up with a small one. So if you are playing the role of Steve Jobs in an actual real world brainstorm session, you all of a sudden become liberated and you can share anything you want. And furthermore, when it comes time to judge the ideas, you're not going to say, oh, we got to go with Jenny's idea because she's the boss. We're like, hey, you know what? Over here, Charlie Parker had a great idea. Let's go with that idea. So it not only removes the fear, it removes the hierarchy.
Totally agree. And that's what we support and push in the age of personalization. But what we tell them is be a character and then be yourself, and then watch the trajectory of your career and respect, watch how it changes. Now, again, I want to encourage everybody, submit your questions, share a story or perspective. Now we have Dave with us. Dave, so great to have you. Please share your question on the open mic to Josh.
Sure. Hey, good to see you, Glenn. Josh, I love what you're saying right now about creativity. And so I don't mean to take a step back, but when you were talking about micro innovations, I kind of wanted to get your sense of how does it differ from lean and continuous improvement? So what's your experience and what you've sort of found about it?
You know, thank you, by the way, for the question, Dave. I think there's a lot of similarities, actually. I don't know that it differs at all or it's in conflict with lean continuous improvement, but it's sort of applying that to other stuff. You know, a lot of times lean, is a very disciplined practice and, it's applied to certain areas in a business, but we can apply that same principle in a lot of areas. So I think Big Little Breakthroughs to a degree is applying those principles, but in non-traditional ways into non-traditional targets. Think about if you had a lean continuous improvement gun and we normally point the gun at like a product or a process. Well, you could also point it at a marketing campaign, or you could have pointed at your hiring approach, or you could point, so it's giving you a sort of a wider set of permissions to apply that to more things. But furthermore, I think it's that it doesn't have to be quite as structured. Obviously with CI, there's a sort of a disciplined structural approach, which is great. I'm not in any way putting that down, but this is a little bit more free flowing. This is a little bit more jazz.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Now we have another question, and I'm going to read it because they're saying that they're an anonymous attendee, and I want to respect that. How important is it for the associates in the field to be empowered to work within their own creativity?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking that. I guess I say Ann because anonymous, and that's like, Ann or Andy maybe. Anyway, good question. I think it's really important to give people permission to be creative in all walks of life. And, the fear creeps in for leaders. They're like, oh, well, I can't give people permission. They're going to do the wrong thing. If you don't have trust in your organization, shame on you as the leader for either hiring the person that you don't trust or building a non-trustworthy culture. Hopefully, you have an organization of trusted, smart, talented people whom you trust. By the way, you're trusting them to take your laptop out of the building. You're trusting them to have your customer list and represent your company. Why wouldn't you trust them to take smart, responsible risks from time to time? So I think that, again, leaders' fear creeps in. We become so protective and think that people are going to misbehave. I would say, let's loosen up the reins. Let people in the field make thoughtful decisions. And if the 1 out of 100 person really does something inappropriate, deal with that separately. But don't, what it reminds me of? You ever go to the hotel room and you're in there, you want to hang up your coat and the hangers are connected to the rod. And you're like, who actually steals a hanger? And so you're going to penalize me for being an honest person from the 1 out of 10,000 people that steal hangers? What? And so don't be that kind of boss, man. Give your people a regular hanger, trust them. And if you find someone stealing the hangers, deal with that separately. But I think we're really missing a trick. The way I look at creativity in an organization is like this. Glenn, let's say I said to you, hey, good news. Outside your home there in Orange County, California, I discovered right in your backyard, you have $1 billion of oil. And it's yours for the keep. All you gotta do is tap into it, get that oil out. You got $1 billion waiting for you. I'm pretty sure you would jump on that. You wouldn't be like, nah, you'd be like, heck yeah, let's go. Well, organizational leaders generally have that $1 billion oil well inside their people. And shame on us for not tapping it. And so if we're so busy putting restrictions on people because we don't trust them, we're so busy trying to protect the downside that we don't tap into that $1 billion of oil, then I don't know if that we deserve to be a leader. So I think, again, core job of leadership is building and extending trust, letting people spread their creative wings. Again, set the parameters, make sure it's done in an appropriate way. No one should go do something, risky or anything, but let people shine a little bit. And I think most leaders will be surprised when you give people freedom, how much love and respect and great work product comes in return.
Josh, when you were talking, we've been hearing this notion about psychological safety, that the employee doesn't have the psychological safety to step up, ask questions, disrupt, be creative. You know what I've concluded? It's not the employees that have the psychological safety issue. It's actually the leaders. Why? Because they know the very people that they're leading know more than they do or aren't that far behind. The only difference between the two is the title. It's no longer about this hierarchy or rank. I think that organizations are going to go flatter and flatter because everyone, as you said earlier, is a contributor to innovation, which brings me to my follow-up question. Tell us about the power of pattern recognition and divergent thinking skills. And before you jump in, this question really grabs me because I think people see the patterns and oftentimes they see them before their leader sees them or before the board sees them, but yet they remain dormant. Try to inspire our listeners and audience now who oftentimes see those patterns, but don't take action on them. And why are they so important?
Well, first, let me just acknowledge the comment that you made before, which is deeply profound. And I agree with 100% that if you have a leader that is creating a fear-based environment, the real fear lives inside that leader. Because if the leader had the confidence, why would you do that? Because you're afraid that your team member is going to outshine you. You're afraid that you don't trust them. They're going to screw something up and make you look bad. I think that's doing a disservice to your organization. And what you said there, I just want to acknowledge that's right on the money and deeply profound.
Thank you.
Back to pattern recognition. You're exactly right. And so we recognize patterns all the time. That's the way our human mind works. And there's a couple of things. One is, you asked how do we muster up the courage to share those patterns? Yeah. I think the best thing to do when we have an idea and we're trying to get our voice heard is, first of all, make it non-confrontational. I think if you're going at somebody straight on, that people can recoil. But what I always suggest people to do if they have ideas or they're seeing things that need to be changed, but they're afraid sort of reaching out to the person of authority to get permission is a two-step thing. First of all, we need to shine a bright flashlight on the real risk of doing nothing. Too often in organizations, there's this inherent belief that, hey, if everything's good, so if we try something by definition, that's risky and standing still is not risky. And how'd that work out for Oldsmobile? How's Pan Am Airlines doing now? They didn't try anything new either. So I think that we got to be honest with ourselves, because anytime you decide to do something of any type, change, innovation, et cetera, there, like those scales of justice, think about a scale, and there's a risk reward thing. And so we have the flawed belief that doing nothing is safe and trying something is risky. So what do? We do nothing. I think we got to rebalance that. First of all, again, really examine the actual risk of doing nothing. And my suggestion is that it will be far riskier than you think. The second thing that we got to do is we got to de-risk the idea of doing something. And you used it earlier, and we got kind of in a new conversation, but you talked about experimentation. And that also is a trigger word for me in the most positive, loving way, because that's the way we de-risk innovation. Most people think of innovation like this: aha moment, global implementation. That's crazy risky. Don't do that. Oh my gosh. Here's the way it should work. Generate, instead of waiting for that one killer idea that changes the world, generate zillions of ideas. And I like to recommend that people keep a running to-test list. All of us have a to-do list. Why not also have a to-test list? And the idea is that cultivate tons of ideas, and then say, how can I test these ideas as cheap and fast and safe as possible? Little micro experiments, little crude, low fidelity experiments. And I think as leaders, we should be testing stuff all the time, like on a Tuesday afternoon for 15 minutes with one client, as opposed to taking an idea and rolling it out globally. So when you get into an experimentation mindset, when you get into a rapid testing mindset, back to our scales of justice here, the risk of doing nothing goes way up and the risk of trying something new goes way down. And then it becomes obvious. It becomes obvious to take those patterns that we're recognizing and put them into action.
I've got to tell you, Josh, I don't know why you just took me back. Oh gosh, maybe 25 years ago, when I received a call from my boss at the time, who says, hey, I got this guy from Mexico calling, Glenn, that wants to talk to you about being able to provide us or supply us artichokes. I was working for an artichoke company at the time. I know, it's kind of funny, but it proves the point, is that I took the call. And bottom line is, 9 months later, I was competing against the brand that I was actually managing. Why? Because the people that asked me to take the call didn't see what was right in front of them, when it was so obvious that the things that we were doing and how the growers and our board was holding us back, that there was a whole other world out in front of us. And so I believe in this notion of big little breakthroughs, because it doesn't have to be a huge thing. Just plant the seed and watch it grow. So on that note, I wanted to get back to this notion of entrepreneurship. A lot of people say that it's scary to be an entrepreneur. Can you perhaps provide some wisdom around, yeah, it may sound scary because you're throwing yourself out there, but what are some lessons learned about being an entrepreneur?
Well, excellent question. And a few thoughts on being an entrepreneur. One is, I kind of think we're all entrepreneurs. I mean, the classic definition is somebody wearing a hoodie, starting a company in a garage, and it's an app, mobile app or something. But why can't we be an entrepreneur of our own life, even if you work in a large company? Or if you're raising kids, be an entrepreneurial parent. And so to me, let's just start with the definition of entrepreneurship, which isn't some, glorified thing only for people who go to Stanford. Like, we can all be entrepreneurs in the regard that we are looking at what's missing or broken. We can look for ways to fix it. We can be creative. I mean, that alone to me is the definition of an entrepreneur, not if someone starts a new LLC that's a Delaware-based corporation or something. So anyway, that's one thought. But the funny thing is that, entrepreneurs are thought of as these gunslinging risk takers. Like, oh, I took this huge bet. And most of the successful entrepreneurs that I know and that I've invested in, and I've helped over 100 startups get off the ground, are not ridiculous risk takers at all. Back to our scales of justice there, they look for ways to de-risk it. Many of the best entrepreneurs don't take that plunge. You know when most entrepreneurs take the plunge to go full time? It's not the day they have the dream. It's the day they run out of sick days, because they're going to moonlight and they're going to tinker and work on their thing. Let your current employer be your first funder, so you can get things going and prototype and test, and you're not under stress to keep your family fed. So it's ironic, because again, we think of entrepreneurs as these crazy risk takers, but not necessarily so. I think they take calculated, thoughtful, responsible risks. One example, by the way, I've bought and sold companies. I've created 10,000 jobs. I spent 30 years as an entrepreneur. I'm going to Vegas next weekend with my wife for a little getaway. I don't gamble ever. Zero. Won't put one quarter in the slot machine. I like the food. I like the shopping and all that. Why? Because I don't think that's a good risk, because I know the casinos are going to win. It's statistically not in my favor. So again, you would think an entrepreneur like me goes there and like, hey, let's go to the, by the way, I'm not criticizing people that gamble. It's, if you enjoy that for entertainment value, have at it. I'm just telling you that you would think someone like me would be like this crazy risk taker. And I don't do that at all, nor do many of the most successful entrepreneurs that I've met.
Hey, by the way, I love what you said, and I was one of them. I remember when I did my contract when I first became a senior executive, and part of the deal was they had to set up an office for me in my home to start my startup. Anything's possible, and you're right. They're the ones that could help you finance it if you play it smart. So let's get right back to the book here, Josh. You've got to tell us about the 8 core obsessions of the everyday innovator. Tell us.
So what happened is in spending now 20 plus years studying human creativity in all walks of life and doing all these interviews and research, I sort of narrowed down the mindsets of innovative people and organizations into these 8 core things. And by the way, most of them are counterintuitive. Like we've been trained the opposite, and these represent the new one. And I can go into as much detail as you want, but just rattling off a couple of them. Start before you're ready, break it to fix it, open a test kitchen. Let's see. Don't forget the dinner mint, fall 7 times, stand 8. Fall in love with the problem, not the solution. I'd probably miss 1 or 2, but I'm happy to elaborate. But the idea is that each of them they're fun, they're kind of catchphrases and memorable, but they're backed by real research. So inside the book, I kind of go through, stories and examples and even tactics on how to bring each of these to the surface. And real quickly, I'll just say that the good thing is that they're portable. You don't have to study them for 40 years. You don't have to invest in millions of dollars. Like you can understand the principle, get it, put it into action tomorrow. So the thing I like about, I tried to do with the book is not only make it fun and upbeat and a little bit funny, but also really eminently practical in a quick way.
Well, before we get to our next question, because Dave's going to come back, tell us about start before you're ready. Tell us about start before you're ready.
Sure. So most of us, we see an opportunity or a challenge and we wait. And what do we wait for? We wait for permission from the boss. We wait until we have a perfect game plan or there's ideal conditions. Excuse me. But the truth of the matter is that waiting is a pretty risky thing because you might miss the opportunity altogether, or you might, at best, you give up your head start. The best of the best do the opposite. They see a challenge or opportunity and they just start now. And they don't have their route fully planned out. And they know they're going to have to bob and weave and pivot and adapt and course correct the changing conditions, but they get after it. And it's this notion of start before you're ready and figure it out in stream that has been the hallmark of many wonderful success stories. And one that comes to mind real quickly. Sorry about that. I don't have COVID, by the way. I gave a keynote earlier, so I'm a little bit hoarse.
It's all good. It's all good. It's a personalization. You don't have to be perfect. Come on, keep going. Take your
exactly. Time. So anyway, there's this woman named Heather Hassan one day sits down at a cafe with a friend of hers who was working at a local hospital. And she noticed that her friend's clothing, the hospital scrubs, looked awful. They were like all scratchy and they like lifelessly hung off her body. And they got the big tag advertising her friend's size. So this woman, Heather, starts asking all these questions like, wait, why is this the only option? And learns that hospital scrubs are terrible and everyone hates them. It's like a running joke. So within days, she grabs her best friend, Trina Spear, and they start ordering comfortable material, stitching it together in their apartment. And they thought, wait, if they can have functional, fashionable athletic wear like Lululemon, why couldn't we create like the Lululemon of scrubs? So within a week, they've got prototypes that they're selling out of their trunk of their car at hospitals during shift changes. They keep tinkering, keep adapting, didn't get everything right, by the way, course corrected, figured out along the way. And within a year, they became this wildly successful company. Only then did they build a business plan and raise money. And long story short, 6 years after starting the company, in May of this year, the company went public on the New York Stock Exchange and is worth $6.8 billion. They're the #1 fashion-forward functional scrub company in the world. And now most people would have done the opposite. They'd see an opportunity, someone else is probably already doing it. Or if they really wanted to go after it, they'd spend years and years in stealth mode and they plan everything out and they want to raise money. Meanwhile, Trina Spear and Heather Hassan would have passed you by. So the notion here is start before you're ready, muster up the courage, do it one big little breakthrough at a time. Don't take overly crazy risks and get going now, figure it out along the way.
You know, Josh, when you brought that up, it reminded me of strategic planning. I don't know how big of a fan you are about an annual strategic plan, but I'm not one of them. I mean, we put these rigorous strategic plans together. Got to make sure that the executives are covered and they're going to get paid for delivering on it. And then what happens? Month 2 comes along. It's not that relevant anymore, or many components of it just don't matter. What are your thoughts about strategic planning? And give us a sense of how you would suggest that we plan our own careers.
Real quickly, it looks like one of the questions in the panelists asked the name of the scrubs company. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it. It's called Figs, F-I-G-S. And it's funny. They're like, hey, there's Lululemon. That's named after a fruit. Apple did pretty well. How about Figs? So Figs, F-I-G-S. Anyway, back to strategic planning. I totally agree with you. Like, by the way, every day that goes by December, your strategic plan is like, it's like the milk that's expired. I mean, come on. So that being said, I don't think we should be rudderless. So I think it's important to set vision. I think it's important to set, goals and work toward objectives, of course, but let's give ourselves the ability to bob and weave as it goes. And actually I have a phrase for that. It's not in my book, but the phrase is compasses over maps. Here's what I mean, Glenn. So let's say you're going to drive from where you are in Orange County over to Holly Springs, North Carolina. So if you look into Google Maps, it tells you what you get on the 405, you go this way, you make 21 miles, take a left. You can turn your brain off and the Google Maps does all the work. That's fine until the road changes or there's an accident or there's construction. Then what do you do? And the problem is that in our lives, we are not living in a fixed highway system. We're living in a 3-dimensional world that changes every 10 minutes. So I don't think relying or leading by Google Maps is an effective strategy. I like the notion of leading by compasses, which is sort of saying, okay, we got to go from Orange County to Holly Springs, North Carolina. You in the car get to figure it out. You get to use your judgment. I've set the waypoint. Why don't you figure out when you're on the ground, what's the best approach? And that encourages people. It actually requires people to use their thinking and creativity and judgment. It requires them to adapt to new circumstances. But I think that's a way more effective approach than locking in some strategic plan, saying my job as a leader is done, because the world is not going to stop. Like if you lived in a vacuum, your strategic plan might be good for a year, but today we live in a rate of change like none other in history. So the minute that strategic plan, the ink is dry, it's already out of date.
Just like when you buy a car, it loses its value immediately. That's so good, right, Josh. So good. All right, Dave, please get on the mic and share your question with Josh.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. So Josh, we are typically, I run a product development team, and we're often trying to do minimum viable products. And that's sort of our way of finding out this thing's going to work or not. We have a build, measure, learn intention. But we often find that these minimum viable products are more expensive or take longer than you think they're going to take to get them developed and then get feedback on them and then figure out what to do. I wonder if you have any sort of recommendations about how to get more efficient feedback from the market and how to sort of decrease the number of turns, tighten up that cycle.
Yeah, really thoughtful question. Thanks for asking that. When I think of a minimum viable product, you're right. Like, because people's standards are so high, it's funny. Now I made a joke one time with a startup I was working with that an MVP, minimum viable product, is almost doesn't even count, because who wants anything that's minimally viable? So to even get your real feedback, you have to have an MVFKP, a minimum viable effing killer product. And you're right, that can take a lot of time and money and everything else. So maybe instead of thinking about it as an MVP, I like this notion of going from crude, low fidelity experiments, and then you start to go over time, once they prove out, to higher fidelity experiments. And so instead of waiting until something's an MVP or not, if you stitch something together with duct tape and paper clips and Play-Doh, could you at least get some customer feedback, recognizing it's not minimally viable at all? It's pre-viable, but at least you start to get a little bit of feedback. And so I like this notion, because the bar for MVPs continues to increase. And by that time, it costs too much and takes too long. So I just like this notion of low fidelity crude experiments. And then as they go down the path, as you stage gate it over time, then the fidelity gets higher. They become more realistic, more lifelike, more and less crude. And then by the time you launch, you've got something you can be proud of and have confidence in.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Now we're getting close to the end here, Josh. And I like for you, if you wouldn't mind, because you mentioned it in the book, tell us about the convicted drug dealer who launched and scaled a fitness company. Tell us about that story.
Sure. funny you mention that because, we've been chatting in a fairly, abstract way, which is just really cool and fun. But the book is really mostly stories. I got one Amazon review. It's like, too many stories. I'm like, too many stories. Who's ever said that? I thought it was kind of funny. Anyway, the story is a fascinating one. And the gentleman that I've gotten to know over the years. So there's a man named Koss Marte, C-O-S-S. His last name is M-A-R-T-E, Koss Marte. And Koss, unfortunately, was, he grew up in a really rough condition. Was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, grew up below the poverty line. And, he had terrible peer influences, a failing school system. He ended up getting into trouble, and he tried drugs for the first time at age 11. And by the age 13, he was selling them. Well, it turns out Koss was a pretty effective innovator. And he told me later, he basically built like Uber Eats for drugs before Uber Eats was around. He ended up, instead of catering to the guys on the street, he built like this very sophisticated on-demand empire of people in suits and ties delivering drugs to very wealthy lawyers and doctors who wanted drugs. And at the time, by age 20, he was making $2 million a year. He had like his whole fleet. But as you might imagine, he ended up to having a regulatory problem. So the New York police came out and shut down Koss's drug business, sent him to prison for 7 years. And at the time, he was in failing health. He was very overweight. He was high blood pressure, not in good condition. And a prison doctor told him that he might not make it out of prison alive, and he may never see his son again. And this was a moment that really changed his life. He's like, I got to do something about this. So nonetheless, he's trying to figure things out in prison. He ends up getting sent to solitary confinement for something he didn't even do. So he's sitting there in this concrete cage, and he says, maybe what am I going to do to pass the time? And what he does is he starts exercising. He just starts doing push-ups and, using his own body weight. And it really made him feel better, helped him get through that 3 weeks of hell. So eventually he's released into the prison population. And to his credit, he became very disciplined. He worked out. He went to the prison library, learned all about nutrition. And over a 6-month period, he lost 70 pounds. Wow. Well, when the other inmates saw this transformation, they're like, wow, can you help me? And then he discovered his purpose. He really wanted to help people not only get in shape to look better, but to take care of themselves, to build self-discipline and self-control. So then he became like a model prisoner. He really helped a lot of other folks get in shape. And by the time he was released from jail, he wanted to have a legitimate, honest, tax-paying life. But try getting a job as a convicted felon, not so easy. So he was really running out of options. No one would hire him. No one would take a call back. So he decided to start a gym. Now that sounds good, but how do you compete with the mega gyms? How do you compete with like LA Fitness or whatever? So he decided to do, instead of becoming the world's 700th lookalike gym, to be the world's first gym of its kind. So he opened up something called Con Body, C-O-N Body, which was a prison-themed gym. And their tagline is pretty funny. It's called Do the Time. So it's like a themed gym. So you walk in, there's like prison cement block, and you go through a metal gate, and then you're training in the yard. There's no fancy equipment. They're doing the same body weight exercises that Koss did when he was in prison. It's like this prison boot camp thing. And they also have some fun, by the way. There's a whole wall where you take pictures like you're in prison with the measurements behind you and post them on social media. And the members of the gym are called inmates instead of members. And the whole thing is very fun and funny. But because it was unique and creative, it really took off. And Koss told me actually he's up to 20,000 paying members of his gym now in New York. Despite the competition, he has an online program where he streams his courses all over the world for a fee. Koss became this remarkably successful fitness entrepreneur with no experience, no money, no resources, other than he was a wildly creative guy that decided to pursue something in a really different manner. And so I really celebrate him. By the way, I've gotten to know him. He's a wonderful human being. He's put his past beside him. He's paid his debt to society. And he really is this caring guy that wants to do right by people, give back to the community. One thing that he does, actually, every employee was formerly incarcerated because he said, I got a second chance. Now I want to give other people a second chance. And he has a zero tolerance for any criminal activity, but he really helps those people get back on their feet. He's a beautiful human being.
It's a great story. It's a great story. And again, I highly recommend everyone to get a copy of Josh's book. It is fueled with stories just like the one that he shared. By the way, I can't believe that someone from Amazon would say that a book has too many stories. I don't buy that either, Josh. I don't buy that either. So we're going to wrap it up here. And I'd like to give everyone a chance, one more shot to get on, be part of the conversation, submit a final question, perhaps a story. So as I give everybody time to think of their final thought, I've concluded, and we've got one more coming up here, Josh, question, but big little breakthroughs, it really replaces the need for transformation, doesn't it? Now, before you answer that question, you know, we're all talking about transformation in corporate America, even in higher education more than ever before. I mean, my goodness, in healthcare, we don't stop hearing that word. I personally don't know how we continue to find the money to finance transformations over and over and over again, because much like a strategic plan, we realized that transformation plan didn't quite hit the mark. But big little breakthroughs really avoids us from falling into the traps of having the need to transform. Am I seeing it right here, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is when someone says, I'm going to do a transformation effort, that means you're going to, you know, change your stripes. You're going to go from a giraffe to a zebra, you know, in 2 seconds. And like, you know, that's why most transformations fail, frankly. They're either wildly improbable, or they're too expensive, or whatever else. So a big little breakthrough is sort of inch in there. You know, the old saying, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? It's sort of like that for creativity. And it's funny, we understand that for other things in our lives, but we don't understand it for the deployment of the imagination. We think that it's just a lightning bolt from the heavens and everything will be great. And it's this natural skill that you either have or you don't. And so I tried to dispel that myth. And I tried to say that, you know, we do need to evolve. We do need to reinvent and rethink for sure. But the way to get there isn't waiting for that silver bullet. It's having the sort of step-by-step, small bite at a time, one big little breakthrough at a time. I think it takes the risk away from transformational efforts, and it has a much higher probability of success. It's fun to think about how, thank God we have a COVID vaccine, thank God. But here's how the COVID vaccine was not invented. It wasn't some dude in a corner office at Pfizer saying, Eureka, I've got an idea, go print 1 billion doses. Like, they would put that person in jail. Instead, in a thoughtful, deliberate way, there was a lab, and they ran a bunch of little teeny experiments and discarded the ones that didn't work and doubled down on the ones that did. And one little step at a time, they were able to, in record time, get a life-saving therapy to market. And so that's how I think we should think about creativity in all aspects of our lives, whether we're trying to reimagine our products and services, or our culture, or our hiring practices, or our efficiency in a factory, or our safety measures in a hospital. One big little breakthrough at a time.
So I want to thank you. And by the way, the last question that came up was from Walt. He says, who goes to Amazon to find a book that doesn't have a story? So we've already addressed that. Did you have?
It was really fun. Actually, my wife and I were cracking up about that, because, you know, we authors are like, well, sensitive about our reviews. And this person, literally, they said, like, you know, good content, but there were too many stories. And we just saw, like, too many stories. That was kind of funny, but I didn't take it personally. It's all good.
Hey, Josh, you were fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate it.
Thanks, brother. And real quick, I just want to acknowledge that you're doing wonderful work. You're making the world a better place in the age of personalization. I have deep admiration for this program and the work that you do in general. So thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to be with you.
Thank you, Josh. And as we always close the show, when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't. Do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. Thank you, my friend. Look forward to continuing the conversation.